For all of the fear mongering that the United States had done about China, the USSR, and other cosmetically communist nations, we certainly do quite a bit of whitewashing and editing of history ourselves. Most people that I encounter have some passing knowledge of the life and times of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but their understanding of MLK and the greater civil rights movement basically consists of people were racist, MLK gave some speeches and did some marches, and then the Civil Rights Act was passed and people weren't racist anymore. Yay! This is little more than a fantasy. The truth will hit you like a tall, refreshing can of twisted tea to the face. So, today is the federal holiday where we observe the birthday of civil rights leader and organizer Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Many of you will make posts and tweets about this man, his goals, and his accomplishments. I think that there is much we can still learn from looking into the work that MLK did and the greater civil rights movement that surrounded him. So, when we talk about MLK and what we can learn from him, we need to understand the political climate of his era. King was active during a time when Jim Crow was still in effect in the South. Segregation was still very entrenched in large portions of the country. Interestingly enough, there was also a very strong anti communist sentiment going on as well, because prior to the New Deal, socialist movements were gaining in popularity, and you had varying levels of support from sitting presidents at the time. This isn't too different from what we're experiencing today. It will always be an uphill battle to gain ground with progressive movements. In the summer of 2020, you had cities across the country erupt in civil disobedience and an outcry against police brutality, only to receive tepid acknowledgement from elected officials. Another parallel that we can draw from MLK's crusades for justice is his relationship with law enforcement and the relationship between law enforcement and activists. By their very nature, cops are going to protect status quo. We saw this during the protests for Black Lives, and we saw this during King's lifetime. Elementary school history books may make some reference to his historic march on Selma, but often truly fail to show the sheer brutality that was visited upon those activists by law enforcement. They committed the crime of crossing a bridge, and the police responded by gassing them and beating them. Aggressive tactics of suppression have gone all the way up to the federal government for years. President Lyndon Johnson, who had met with King in person, would ultimately have government agencies begin spying on him. They tapped his phone line, sent him messages telling him to kill himself under the threat of exposing sordid affairs to the public. They also warned him to not work with any communist organizations lest they remove all federal support from his goal of desegregation. Basically, they used all of the tactics that they've used against leftist movements throughout this country's history, many of which they still use to this day. And make no mistake, organizing and activism then, just as now, was incredibly dangerous. Everyone knows that he was ultimately assassinated, but he had several attempts on his life. A mentally unstable woman stabbed him at an event, fearing that he was an agent of secret communists. In Birmingham, Alabama, the police responded with force against the demonstrators, using water hoses and attack dogs against many women and children. Footage of this incident and the bloody Sunday in Selma showed many white people viewing at home the true brutality used to silence dissent. King would go on to be arrested 29 times during his lifetime. His historic mountaintop address was delayed due to a bomb threat that was made against his plane, and of course, this would be his last public address before being fatally shot on his balcony. So, what did the work of MLK teach us that we can use even now in the present day? Well, diversity of tactics, collective organizing, and the power of coalition building. King advocated for large-scale and highly visible civil disobedience. It was his citywide boycott that ultimately broke the back of the bus segregation and won a victory for the bus boycott. Facing down Bull Connor and the police and their attack dogs and water hoses ultimately led to the desegregation of public places in Birmingham and the removal of Jim Crow-era signage. When he gave his speech on Washington, he covered many of the same things that we are arguing for today: democratic representation and leadership for D.C., a drastic increase in the minimum wage. He staged protests across Atlanta, which would ultimately be the driving force behind their desegregation of schools and public counters. He would also have failures in organizing and would learn from them. His efforts in Albany, Georgia failed to deliver on his demands, but he pushed forward and took lessons from the response. Much like today, we aren't going to be successful in every battle we wage. Sometimes our efforts will be squashed by the state or by fascist actors. Our goal should be to learn and continue growing. He moved his organization to Chicago for a period to experience the housing disparity and discrimination in one of the largest northern cities. MLK used covert spies in the application process to uncover deeply rooted bias in the approval for rental properties. However, the biggest thing that we can take from King's efforts: he and his allies didn't always agree. All movements are complicated and have contention amongst their coalitions. Malcolm X called the March on Washington the farce on Washington. The NOI forbade all members from attending, mainly due to the fact that King acquiesced to President Kennedy's demands that the focus of the event be shifted to a more palatable racial harmony tone. Kennedy also wanted him to distance himself from prominent communist leaders out of fear that it would discredit the movement, even though some of those leaders helped him organize some of his largest campaigns. Bringing about a positive revolution is hard work, and it doesn't come easy, and it's never a smooth process. There are going to be disagreements among progressive actors in any movement. We may not see eye to eye on every issue. A black anarchist might see things differently than a white Marxist-Leninist. A white communist might see things differently than an indigenous liberation activist. The fight for black liberation, indigenous land rights, empowerment of labor, rights for the differently abled, or opponents to American imperialism may all have different goals. But we all certainly have a common foe, and that foe is the status quo, the white supremacist system enabled by neoliberal capitalism. King understood this. And each and every one of you watching this can follow in his footsteps within your own communities. Stage a sit-in, organize a strike, donate to a worthy cause, or if you're able, just help someone in your neighborhood going through hard times. And maybe, just maybe, we shall overcome. Someday.